Welcome to Reformation 2017, Re-fermenting the Church, Part 3D. My name is Ron Rude. We are in Part 3, the heart of these 12 Ron Talks, and I'm suggesting that it is time for a re-fermenting of the Christian Church. That is, for an alternative version or brew of Christian theology and practice to emerge. We are looking in this part through the lens of the natural sciences in order to see more clearly God's mammoth history of the universe and multi-leveled and layered and unfolding story of life. A story that is incredibly vast and is being read by every ecosystem and species in the universe in their own language, and marvelously ancient, at least 13.7 billion years old. Our species, Homo sapiens, which has been invited to take up residence in one of the 20 million or so niches or dwelling places in the Creator's household on this planet. There are about 20 million species on Earth. We humans have been around for about 200,000 years. But I suggested in the previous Ron Talk 3C that something began to go awry in our species just a few thousand years ago, maybe 6 or 8 or 10,000 years ago. That has something to do with why Judaism and Christianity are such recent and brand new religions, and why these religions seem to be about the reign of God, and why these religions are addressed to one species only, namely us. And not because we humans are so special, but because we are the one species that has recently become at odds with, indeed at war with, God's primary mission, the story of life. So God had a dilemma, and it had to do with an aberrant narrative emerging in the few of the tens of thousands of human cultures around this planet, a narrative that has spread so thoroughly and far and wide that it is now, in our day, the dominant narrative of our species. The new narrative is this: rather than this tov earth belonging to the whole community of life, including humans, the new aberrant narrative or worldview has arisen that asserts earth belongs to humans. Another way to say it, alluding to the Gospel of John, chapter 14, is that we have begun to leave the Creator's house under the permeating reign of God and instead have declared our own house under the dominating rule of humans. I'm suggesting that this change profoundly troubles the Creator and is what the fall parables are all about. It is also what prompted God's recent and secondary mission, that is, to try and heal our species. Daniel Erlander describes it this way: humans decided to find joy in becoming big deals. How did humans know if they were big deals? They knew by bossing others around, by piling up stuff, by dominating nature, and by reaching glorious heights of health and beauty and knowledge. They also know by having more points than other humans in their scoring systems. And the prophet Hosea said it this way: hear the word of the Lord, O people, for the Lord has an indictment against the inhabitants of the land. There is no faithfulness or loyalty and no knowledge of God in the land. Swearing, lying, and murder, and stealing, and adultery break out. Bloodshed follows bloodshed. Therefore, the land mourns, and all who live in it languish, together with the wild animals and the birds of the air. Even the fish of the sea are perishing. I want to begin using a metaphor here of Abel and Cain. I'm not particularly referring to the actual parable in Genesis chapter 4, so much as I'm using the Abel and Cain metaphor as a background template for two starkly different ways of being in God's world. For Abel, the earth belongs to the whole community of life, including humans. But in Cain's worldview, which I deem to be perverse, our species sees itself as separate from, superior to, the reason for, and the ruler of everything else. It can't be overemphasized how different these worldviews are, and how these worldviews produce starkly different and contrasting behaviors. In fact, I would argue that Cain's worldview produces only misbehavior. Abel takes what is truly needed, but Cain cultures, on the other hand, take and take and take. What does this mean? It means that economics, which is all about living responsibly within the oikoi, that's the Greek word for household, which includes the ecosystems of air and water and soil and plant and animal life. Economics has regressed or de-evolved or shrunk into humanism, where humans are trying to get more and more stuff, much of it nonsense, for humans. And science, which is learning about God's world and how to fit in well and to work with the patterns of wisdom that God has implanted, has regressed into scientism, trying to overcome, modify, and remake God's creation in our image, thinking that if we can do it, we should. Politics, which should be the art and science of seeking the common good, has now regressed into humanism too, with winners and losers, and people pursuing power in order to dominate other humans and dominate nature, turning us on many levels into conquistadors. Even academia has become an enterprise of human self-aggrandizement. While there are pockets of exceptions, surely, the university too is mostly a cane system, training canes how to be successful canes in a cane world. In order to get funding, professors have to always justify their research in terms of human and often economic priorities. And even Christianity, I would argue, has regressed. It has devolved. It has shrunk into humanism. That is, a mere and diminutive melodrama about how much we think God gushes over us. Again, this regression is very recent. So how did God's secondary mission unfold in the Old Testament? Well, shortly after Genesis 6:6, as Daniel Erlander calls the saddest verse in the Bible, we find a parable of a giant flood. I intentionally use the word parable here. As I said in Ron Talk 2a, there is no scientific evidence of a flood of this magnitude taking place on the earth when humans were around. And further, and this is even more troubling, to see this event as a historical event would mean that God is a God of genocide. The storytellers tell this parable, I think, to show the kind of behavior that God will not be doing to try to heal humans. Killing off a bunch of evil people is not the way to get rid of evil. But the storytellers do portray historical events, and one of them is the creation of a chosen people. The prophet Isaiah describes the reason for this chosen people. In the days to come, the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established at the highest of mountains, and shall be raised above the hills, and all nations shall stream to it. Many people shall say, Come, let us go to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways, and that we may walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth instruction, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. So, where do you find a chosen people? Well, in the story, God goes to Egypt, a Cain culture. You can see at the top of the pyramid are the wealthy and the politically connected. Then comes the landowners, followed by carpenters and farmers and shepherds and tradesmen, some of whom work for slave wages or are actual slaves. Cain cultures prey on surrounding poorer nations, leveraging and extracting natural resources from them, as well as cheap labor. And of course, in Cain's world, the rest of nature, the wider community of life, gets the shaft. And who are the keepers and sanctifiers of the system? Well, the military and religion. These leverage the world in Cain's favor and provide religious cover for this perverse system. So God finds her chosen people amongst the enslaved peoples of Egypt, the Hebrews. He rescues them and sends them into the desert for 40 years of wilderness school, to use Daniel Erlander's term, to learn how to live responsibly and wisely, and then to become teachers of the rest of their species. It's important to notice that God did not set the Israelites free in order for them to be free. Freedom can be a false god too, and many nations, including ours, have committed unspeakable atrocities in the name of freedom. God also didn't set them free in order that they might climb up the pyramid ladder, so to speak, so that next time they can be near to the top. No, God sent them to wilderness school in the desert to teach them a more grounded and honorable way of being in the world, the able way. However, too often they understood their chosenness to be about special status rather than special service. This can happen to Christians too. So God tried a system of laws, and laws are necessary. They help to bring order and at times even justice to society. But they don't really heal people, and they don't transform our inner spirits and souls and selves. In fact, a person can obey every law in the books and still be rotten to the core. Next came a system of kingships. First there was Saul, who began okay, but soon was rotten to the core. Then came King David, who started out pretty well, but soon also regressed into tyranny. The story of David's rape of Bathsheba and his subsequent arranged murder of Bathsheba's husband, Uriah the Hittite, is not only a story about personal failings, it is also a metaphor of how Cain cultures function in this world, toward other human beings and toward nature. King Solomon too began wisely, but soon regressed. He engaged in uncontrollable concupiscence, that is, gathering all things unto himself. He warred against neighboring nations to get access to their resources. He had 700 wives and 300 girlfriends or concubines. And he built a temple supposedly to the Lord on the backs of people he enslaved. Slave labor. Can you imagine anything more profane and sacrilegious and evil and contrary to everything God stands for? So, in just 100 years, everything had come full circle. King Solomon had become just another Pharaoh, and Israel just another Egypt. The monarchy gave way to Cain's way of being in the world. God tried sending prophets who spoke words of warning and hope, but this didn't heal us either. So, what to do? The problem is that we are out of control species because we are out of relationship with our neighbor, with nature, with our own inner spirit and soul and self, and with God. To be out of relationship is to be in a state of dis-ease, to have a sickness unto death, to be groaning in travail, to be walking around in a state of existential disrepair, to be perishing. Is there anything left? What will God do? God sent many Abels in the form of rabbis and prophets, people who understood Abel wisdom, indigenous peoples who were still practicing the Abel way and knew that the earth belonged to the whole community of life. Sometimes people on the margins had a perspective that cut through the perversity of the majority populations. And of course, the wider community of life was then and is today brimming with wisdom and intelligence and hope. Is there anything left? In the next Ron Talk 3E, we will explore God's action in and through a mammal of the species Homo sapiens named Jesus of Nazareth.